The majority of defendants accept their fate and move on, but when Pam Bondi received a sudden fine, she retaliated with such precision that the judge was left questioning his own decision. Pam Bondi had no idea how bad the day would get. Courtroom 3B in a Tampa courthouse was supposed to be just another stop in her schedule. A quick hearing, nothing more. She'd been in this room dozens of times, facing judges with varying levels of experience, but nothing about today seemed out of the ordinary. She sat at the defendant's table and looked over a few notes with a neutral expression. Across from her, a city attorney adjusted his tie, shifting in his seat as he waited for the judge to enter. The case was a minor dispute, at least that's what it was supposed to be, a procedural matter that wouldn't take more than 10 minutes. But Pam knew something was wrong as soon as Judge Raymond Dalton entered. Dalton was a man who commanded the room without saying much. Tall, with a graying beard and deep-set eyes, he carried an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Normally, judges took a moment to review files, give a nod to the attorneys, and settle in before making any remarks. Not Dalton. He said, "Let's get right to it," but his face and voice were hard to read. Recognizing the change in tone, Pam slightly straightened. Dalton continued, "I find that the defendant is subject to a fine of $10,000, payable immediately, in violation of Local Statute 14B after considering the arguments. The court has reviewed the matter at hand." Silence. Pam's brow lifted, just slightly, but inside her mind was already working. She had expected an argument, a discussion, maybe even a warning. But this? A summary judgment with no discussion at all? Nearly apologizing, the city attorney gave her a quick glance. Even he hadn't expected the case to move this fast. Pam calmly folded her hands, her voice even. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we have not even begun the proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my arguments." Dalton barely blinked. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear." Pam inhaled slowly, keeping her expression unreadable. The room was still, too still. She wasn't the kind of attorney to lose her composure, but something about this felt deliberate. This wasn't just a ruling, this was a statement. She glanced at Dalton, studying him. Beyond mere judicial authority, there was a confidence hidden behind his eyes. He wasn't just ruling on a case, he was putting her in her place. Pam's tone of voice remained firm but measured. "If the law were that clear, we wouldn't be here, Your Honor. Your Honor, I request the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton leaned back slightly, as if he had expected her to push back. Something that wasn't quite a smile formed on his lips. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi, but I assure you the outcome will be the same." That was when she knew. She was the focus of this, not just the case. Pam adjusted the papers in front of her, more for effect than necessity. The fine itself wasn't the issue, she'd fought bigger battles. But the principle? That was something she couldn't ignore. She met Dalton's gaze directly. "Then I suppose we should get started." The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted again, uncomfortable. The court stenographer, silent until now, repositioned in her chair. Even a few spectators in the back leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Pam took one last glance at the legal brief in front of her, though she didn't really need it. She had already decided what she would do. Dalton thought he had the upper hand, but he was about to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. But before anyone could speak again, Pam raised her hand, a signal that she wasn't finished. And what came next would leave the entire courtroom stunned. Pam let the silence linger just long enough to make an impact. She did not hurry or flinch. Before finally looking up at Judge Dalton, she simply turned one page in her folder, more for effect than necessity. "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something." She spoke with unwavering consistency. "Are you implying that the defense has no right to make its case in a court of law?" Dalton's expression didn't change. "I'm saying the violation is clear and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly like she was studying him. Then she nodded. "Interesting." Dalton shook his head. "Excuse me?" Pam leaned back just a little, keeping her tone casual. It's just, I've been practicing law for quite some time, and in all those years, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it. It's, what's the phrase? Unprecedented. Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him, yet. She was setting the stage, forcing him to respond. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and law clerks waiting for their cases, were now fully invested. A few exchanged glances, even the bailiff, a man who had probably seen 1,000 hearings just like this one, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton took a deep breath and slowly. Ms. Bondi, this court does not handle drama. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands and we move on. Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He had unlocked the door. Once more, she adjusted her papers without looking down at them. She looked directly at the judge. Very well, let's talk about Local Statute 14B, the one you claim I violated. She tapped her finger on the printed document in front of her. You say the law is clear, but that's interesting because I happen to know that this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years with varying interpretations. Dalton's eyes narrowed. The language in subsection C, for example, Pam continued, her voice smooth, almost conversational, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that just last year, a ruling from the appellate court found that imposing fines under this statute without allowing for due process constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. The courtroom was silent completely. Pam could feel the shift happening. The judge knew it too. Dalton sharpened his voice by straightening it. Those cases do not apply here. Pam didn't miss a beat, don't they? She turned another page because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they do. The language of the ruling in Reynolds v. Clearwater was pretty clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let the words sink in before adding, and I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore precedent. Dalton tightened his teeth. Pam let that hang in the air for just a second before delivering the next blow. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law, in which case I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. Are you threatening to appeal to this court, Ms. Bondi? Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh without amusement. Your Honor, I don't make threats. I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle but important. She had altered the balance of power. She had forced the judge to defend his position rather than simply issuing rulings without question. Dalton knew it too. The city attorney, who had been sitting quietly up until now, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may, Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off. His focus remained fixed on Pam's. There was a long pause, then finally the judge spoke. Very well, you may present your defense. Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. But just as she was about to speak, Dalton did something that made it clear. He wasn't going to make this easy. Judge Dalton didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt more like a warning than permission. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. No longer was this just about the law. It had to do with control. He wanted to ensure that she was aware of her exact position in his courtroom. But she wasn't the type to be intimidated. She changed her posture and kept her face hidden. Let's start with the language of the statute itself. She tapped the documents. According to Local Statute 14B, a fine may be imposed on any organization that violates a municipal regulation. It's easy enough. However, the definition of compliance is the problem. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, looking unimpressed. And yet, Ms. Bondi, this law has been followed consistently and without incident. Pam tilted her head. That's interesting, because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She gave the city attorney a quick glance before returning to Dalton. Unless you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly. Ms. Bondi, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written. Before speaking, Pam allowed a beat of silence. Except when it isn't. A whisper from the room's back. Pam reached for another document and held it up. Let's discuss Henderson versus the city of St. Petersburg. This very statute resulted in a fine for the defendant in that case. The same approach to enforcement and wording. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She took a moment to emphasize. You know what the judge said in that ruling? That the law as it is applied doesn't give enough notice or have clear rules for how to enforce it, so it can't be enforced if you look at it. Dalton's jaw tension said enough despite his blank expression remaining. The city attorney leaned in slightly. Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked. Pam turned her gaze toward him, cutting him off before he could continue. Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. If you have a legal basis that contradicts Henderson, please enlighten us. The lawyer was hesitant. His silence spoke volumes. Pam turned back to Dalton. Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm requesting consistency. If a higher court has already determined that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it? Dalton sat back, his eyes scanning her, calculating. Pam knew exactly what he was doing, stalling, trying to find an angle where he could regain control. He finally spoke. The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours. Pam didn't even blink. True, but the precedent holds true nonetheless. Either the law is clear or it isn't. Silence. The weight in the room had shifted. Despite the fact that the judge was legally wrong, Pam was aware that she had him in a corner because she had put him in a position where any decision he made now would be scrutinized. He could move forward, disregard precedent, and run the risk of having his decision reversed. Or he could backpedal, which would mean conceding that he had acted prematurely. Despite the fact that he was the one who had put himself there, Pam did not envy his position. Dalton took a deep breath and slowly. Ms. Bondi, I disagree with your interpretation. Pam gave a slight grin. Then let's debate it. The judge's nostrils flared slightly. Then to her surprise, he reached for his gavel. The court will take a 15-minute recess. He stood before anyone could argue, then turned and disappeared into his chambers. Pam set her papers down, her expression calm, but inside she knew what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to give in, but he also wasn't ready to rule against her outright. He needed time to think, to strategize, maybe even to look up the case she had just cited. That meant she had him on the ropes. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone. And what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. 15 minutes felt like an hour. With her hands lightly resting on the stack of papers in front of her, Pam remained seated at the defense table. She wasn't reading them. She didn't need to. The legal precedents, the procedural arguments, the case law she had cited were all burned into her mind. She was ready. However, Judge Dalton's abrupt break didn't sit well with her. He wasn't the type to hesitate, which meant he was either regrouping or preparing for something she hadn't accounted for. Dalton entered once more with a new companion as the judge's chamber's door swung open. A second judge, someone Pam immediately recognized, Judge Alan Whitaker, a senior judge, higher ranking than Dalton. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed as soon as Whitaker walked in. This was not typical procedure. Bringing in another judge mid-hearing, that wasn't just unusual, it was calculated. Pam adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Dalton cleared his throat before sitting down. Before we proceed, I've requested that Judge Whitaker sit in on this matter.
Requested? Pam didn't believe that for a second. Someone had pulled strings.
Her calm but authoritative presence was matched by Whitaker's slow nod.
Bondi, I understand you've raised procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of Statute 14b.
His gaze met evenly with Pam's.
That's correct. Whitaker clasped his hands in front of him. Based on precedent from the appellate court, do you believe this fine should be reversed? She didn't hesitate. I don't believe it. I know it.
The courtroom was shaken by a faint murmur.
Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitaker bowed his head. I appreciate your confidence, but let's discuss specifics.
You referenced Henderson Verde City of St. Petersburg.
Are you aware that a follow-up ruling later clarified that certain interpretations of the statute could remain enforceable under localized judicial discretion?
Pam kept her expression neutral, but inside she felt a shift. So that's what this was. They were now attempting to counter her argument with an overlooked technicality after Dalton had taken a step back and brought in someone with more authority.
Pam put her hands together.
I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor, but I also know that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards, something that in this case was not done.
Whitaker nodded as if anticipating her response. Then let's talk about that.
The enforcement officer who filed the violation is present in this courtroom.
Would you like to cross-examine him?
Pam barely hid her surprise. She hadn't expected that, but she welcomed it. She turned her head as a man stood from the back of the room.
Officer Brian Calloway is a police officer for the city.
He was middle-aged, dressed in a crisp navy uniform, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his decisions.
Pam maintained a steady voice. Yes, Your Honor, I would.
Dalton gestured for Calloway to step forward. The officer proceeded to the witness stand, swore, and then sat down. Pam was standing there and taking deliberate, slow steps toward him.
Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation? He nodded. Yes, ma'am.
Pam turned slightly toward the where no jury was present, but where the public sat watching.
And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred? Calloway exhaled as if the answer was obvious. The statute is clear. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine.
Pam clasped her hands behind her back.
Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? He hesitated.
No, ma'am, it wasn't necessary. She gave him a slight, almost joking smile.
Yet you assessed a fine even though you did not document the violation?
Calloway shifted in his seat. I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw. Pam's expression remained calm, but inside she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. She turned back toward the bench. Your Honor, in the absence of photographic evidence, written witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual's subjective assessment. This directly conflicts with the evidentiary requirements outlined in Judge Whitaker's earlier reference to the appellate clarification. Whitaker sat back slightly, but his expression remained unchanged. He knew that she was correct.
Pam continued forward. Therefore, I ask once more, how does this court justify imposing a fine based on a statute that lacks the legal foundation necessary for enforcement?
The room's silence was deafening. The bench was being rubbed against by Judge Dalton's fingers. He wasn't looking at Whitaker, and that told Pam everything she needed to know. He had expected to win this argument. He had hoped that Whitaker's presence would force her into a corner, but she took his own counterpoint and used it to dismantle the case against her.
Dalton gave a strong exhale. This court will recess once more. Pam resisted the urge to smile.
She was aware of every detail. They were running out of ways to push back, but when the court reconvened, what Dalton did next was something no one saw coming. Pam remained seated as the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs.
Another recess?
That certainly wasn't a good sign for the judge. She knew better than to celebrate too soon because it indicated that he was struggling to regain control of a situation that had already passed through his hands. Dalton was a man of authority, and people in positions of authority detested being challenged. He wasn't going to back down that easily. When the court reconvened, Dalton's demeanor had shifted. His earlier state of passive confidence had vanished. His expression was now hard to read as his jaw locked. Even though his posture was more reserved this time, Whitaker was still seated next to him. It was abundantly clear that he had no immediate plans to intervene. Dalton opened his mouth. "Ms. Bondi, you've presented compelling arguments." Pam was able to hear the tightness in his measured tone. He was not accustomed to making even the tiniest concessions. However, this court still finds the core issue remains unchanged. The fine remains. One blink from Pam. That was fascinating. So he was doubling down. She exhaled slowly and nodded as if she was carefully considering his words. She quickly turned to the court stenographer after that. "Can you read back the last statement, please?" The stenographer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, barely hesitated before repeating, "The fine stands." Pam turned back to Dalton. "Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof in direct contradiction to established appellate precedent?" Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench. "Ms. Bondi, this court has discretion." Pam's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "It does, but discretion is not immunity from legal standards." The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing where this was going. Pam straightened, stepping closer to the bench. "Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any enforcement officer can issue a fine based on nothing more than their word. There is only an assertion, no evidence, and no documentation." Dalton's silence told her everything she needed to know. She turned to the gallery, sweeping her gaze across the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders who had sat through the hearing. Imagine the implications of that. A business owner gets fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner is penalized for something they can't even verify. It would be a shame if they challenged it. The court has discretion. A few heads gave a subtle nod. Pam turned back to Dalton. "That's not discretion, Your Honor. That is unchecked power." The weight of her words sank into the room. Whitaker finally spoke. "You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process?" Pam gave a nod. "Not just due process, but judicial integrity. Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertion rather than evidence, the entire legal system starts to erode." Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. He was aware that he had been forced into a corner. The city attorney finally interjected. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton held up a hand. His face was unreadable, but Pam could see the frustration in his eyes. There was no winning this. For him, not. Dalton finally exhaled after what seemed like an eternity. "The fine imposed by this court does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement, according to this court." His voice was stiff, almost reluctant. "The fine is overturned." A murmur rippled through the room. Pam nodded slowly and politely. No satisfaction. No gloating. Merely subdued certainty. Dalton tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. She saw Whitaker looking at her as she turned to go, his expression being hard to read. She then once more heard Dalton's voice as she made her way toward the exit. "Ms. Bondi." She turned. Her eyes met Dalton's. "I underestimated you." Pam gave him a small smile. "You wouldn't be the first." Her heels clanked against the polished floor as she turned and left the courtroom. But as she left, she knew one thing for certain. This case wouldn't just be forgotten. It had set a precedent. One that would ripple far beyond this courtroom. And somewhere, in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. Pam walked down the marble hallway, her pace steady, but her mind still sharp. The weight of what had just happened wasn't lost on her. She had entered that courtroom anticipating a standard hearing. What she got instead was a battle of power, law, and ego. And she had won. But she also knew something else. People like Dalton didn't forget moments like these. They didn't like losing, especially not in front of a full courtroom. As she neared the courthouse exit, a voice called from behind. "Ms." For a moment, Bondi. She turned to find Judge Whittaker approaching, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't the kind of man who engaged in unnecessary small talk. So if he was stopping her now, it wasn't just to exchange pleasantries. Pam crossed her arms loosely. "Something on your mind, Judge?" Whittaker studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're good." Pam smiled slightly. "I try." He nodded, glancing briefly at the courtroom doors behind him before lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. "Ms., I was not invited in to observe." "Bondi." "I was brought in to contain." Pam raised an eyebrow. "To contain what, exactly?" With his eyes on her, Whittaker exhaled and exhaled. Judge Dalton doesn't like losing. In this case, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting an example. Pam already knew that, but hearing it confirmed only made the victory feel more significant. She kept her tone consistent. "So what happens now?" Whittaker hesitated, then gave her a look that held both respect and warning. "You won't just be watched by this group of people." Pam was completely aware of what he meant. Today, she had done more than win a case. She had challenged a system that thrived on compliance, and that didn't go unnoticed. She nodded once. "I appreciate the heads up." Before turning back toward the courtroom, Whittaker gave her one final glance. Pam turned toward the exit, pushing the heavy courthouse doors open and stepping into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different, lighter, sharper. This wasn't the first time she had fought a battle in court, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was a lesson in today's fight, one she hoped others would see. Power wasn't about who sat behind the bench. It wasn't about titles, robes, or authority. It was about knowing the rules well enough to challenge them. It was about standing firm when others expected you to back down. And most importantly, it was about never assuming that just because someone hands you a ruling, you have to accept it. Pam Bondi had entered that courtroom anticipating a typical hearing. She left after reminding everyone, particularly those in positions of authority, that the law was about more than just enforcement. It all came down to comprehension. It was about fighting back. And today, she had done just that. If you found this story engaging, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Because in every courtroom, in every fight, there's always more than meets the eye.